So thank you so much, Charlotte, for setting the scene so well. And I'm really delighted to be here. Several of us are wondering why, as Director for Climate Change from the World Bank, I would be coming to a biogas summit. Well, from a personal point of view, as a sanitary engineer, I've always loved anaerobic digestion. And when I was working as the Global Director for Water and Sanitation for all the years, unfortunately, in many of the markets where we work, people were not paying attention to it. If we look at the coverage of sanitation and wastewater treatment around many of the low-income and emerging markets, we can look at that as a huge opportunity for us in the biogas world. My teenage son actually thought I came here to go to the Snoop Dogg concert last night. I don't know if any of you went to that. It was no. In all seriousness, I mean, Charlotte, you've actually, put forward the dire situation that we are. The IPCC report. We are so far way off target to meet the 1.5 degrees. We just need to do everything possible to stay, hopefully, within the 2 degrees, but even still be committed to come back to the 1.5. From where I sit as the World Bank Group, as a development institution, we actually see the world, the myriad of interrelated crises. And I saw last year you had Franz Timmermans as a keynote speaker, and it was right after Russia invaded Ukraine, coming off the COVID-19 pandemic. We've seen the impact of that with the creation of the lack of fertilizers across the world. And a few months after the Russian invasion, in fact, I was in Africa and we were meeting in Senegal with the President Macky Sall, who's also the President of the African Union, and the impact of not having fertilizer across the continent is just dramatic, right? So again, there's so much more opportunities where people are looking for new solutions, renewable, recycled type, circular economy approaches to what they're doing. And what we're seeing, though, is that also the huge debt burden and the fiscal strain of many of our countries really makes it very, very difficult for them to keep on borrowing and borrowing for these solutions. So we really do need to find a way that you have the windfall profits from the fossil fuel companies. How do you actually change that into investment in a different type of development pathway that will be much more climate informed? And we know that where we sit as a development institution, we actually see the human impact of this constellation of interrelated global crises. And we just see how the impact also of the climate crisis, in particular, on people's livelihoods and the sustainability of our natural environment and biodiversity. We know that all countries have to act on climate, even though the climate crisis does not affect all countries equally. The countries with the highest emissions are those most able to adapt to the impact of this climate pollution, which is felt even more strongly in countries that have not contributed to the problem. So 74% of the world's poorest countries account for less than 1/10 of the global GHG emissions. And our analysis shows, and you mentioned this, Charlotte, the impact on migration, that climate change could drive over 200 million people to migrate within their own countries by 2050, and global hotspots of internal migration emerging as soon as 2030. We also know that the economic impact that these flash floods can have in Pakistan, which caused $30 billion in damages, but also are projected to reduce their GDP by 18 to 20%. So anyway, I think we all know that climate change poses a major threat to development. And at the same time, we see that there's a huge opportunity for an industry such as this one, which is focused on renewables and resource reuse. As a World Bank and many other multilateral development banks, we have committed to be Paris-aligned as this July. And what does that mean, being Paris-aligned? That means that for every project that we do, every investment, we look at what is the development objective it's trying to achieve, and is this supporting and helping countries achieve its low emissions trajectory, and is it doing one in a way that's taking into account adaptation and the need to be resilient? I mean, that is a huge game changer if you think that all the multilateral development banks look at it that way. So that actually means also, how do we support countries to make sure they put in place the low emissions trajectory, the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, that can build into clear targets, good targets, and how we can fit then biogas and other solutions into these, and of course within the context of 100 countries responding to the global methane pledge. So also for us, what's really important now is that we have so many developing countries and emerging markets that have an opportunity to leapfrog their development pathway away from high carbon intensity and make choices now that would avoid them having to clean up and decarbonize later. And we can also zoom in and prioritize the middle income countries with the largest populations, because those are the ones who are going to come in next in terms of having high carbon lifestyles and have the biggest impact. And these are the countries you mentioned. You have India and Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia, South Africa, China. And so these are actually exciting market opportunities if we look at the international and the National Biogas Association, and what is needed for us to be able to move into these markets. You might also know at the same time, for those of you who follow the COP process and went to COP 27, this is the first time ever that the multilateral development banks were actually mentioned in a COP agreement. We're not party to these agreements. We're an observer and an implementing agency. But you might know, and you probably hear, the huge call to reform the World Bank, to reform the Multilateral Development Organization. So I wake up every morning and everyone's reforming us, which is actually fantastic. But what it is, it's pushing us to do much more in the climate direction, but it's actually what the challenge is how do we mobilize and leverage huge, huge amounts of trillions of dollars of climate finance? And that's what it's all about. How do we put the grant money, concessional financing, in with private financing to accelerate climate action and development impact? But we know at the same time what's most important is to work at the country level on policies, on regulations, unlocking the market, on the financing, understanding what it will take to scale up investments. And Charlotte, you did again, I have all your numbers that you just repeated again, but it's important that we do know that if we recycle the 105 billion tons of organic waste, I want to repeat those numbers, that humans generate each year, we can reduce global GHG emissions by 10%, but we can deliver half the global methane pledge. And that's huge, because people have and countries have committed to the global methane pledge. And so what we see, though, is that the investment is not keeping up with the eventual investment potential. And we're trying to understand why this is. And last year I went back to look at your keynote opening speeches, and I just wanted, they were fantastic to hear Franz Timmerman and Rick Duke, and two very different approaches to the urgency of the problem and what a possible government policy solution could be. And I thought in the EU, you have set very, very high ambitious targets, which helps a lot. Also supporting countries to create the implementation plans, to create the partnerships, to find ways to overcome the regulatory barriers and to speed up permitting, to reduce costs. He spoke of funds for R&D, for innovation, and also to set binding regulations. You use, therefore, a carrot and stick type of approach, which is fantastic, and it really gives you this enabling environment. In the US, it's a very slightly different approach. It's very much focused on incentives, and the IRA, the IRA Act is just putting huge, huge amounts of financial and economic incentives into the market. So again, this is wonderful. What lessons can we take from these types of approaches to bring them to the emerging markets? And we believe that there's three things that we can do to really support rolling out biogas at scale across the world. Again, starting off with helping countries look at the policies, the regulations, the incentives, and set the country ambition and targets. I really like that. You have to have that target, and you have to be accountable to a target. The second one is to understand what the institutional implementation arrangements are. What's the role of the public sector? What's the role of the private sector? Taking into account all of the diversity of the different types of feedstocks and the different actors in the chain, in the whole value chain of value gas, from the different large-scale farmers, small-scale farmers, landfills, wastewater treatment plants. So that whole ecosystem, how does it all come together, map it out? And of course, how do we crowd in financing? How do we leverage concessional financing where needed to piggyback with private financing? That's where we look to you to actually come up with ideas together how we can do this. So I wanted to give you examples of three projects that we've done, three programs, just to give you an idea of the where we work. I'll start off with one in Burkina Faso in the Sahel, and that's where we're working to provide this results-based climate finance to incentivize farmers to invest in small-scale biogas digesters. And this might not mean very much. These are small-scale programs with farmers, 35,000 farmers. But what's really important is how do you actually design the system, the institutional mechanism and the financing mechanism. What are the right level of subsidies? How do you help bring down the investment costs? How do you train the farmers? But how do you focus on the results-based payment systems? And so what we did there is we worked very hard to try to quantify this into an emissions reductions payment agreement, an ERPA, as a way to move towards carbon markets. And I think that's an important thing if we want to crowd in finance. And in that case, we're working on MRV systems, on what are the right, monitoring, verification that we can have that gives credibility to it. And so from there, we're developing a standardized crediting framework that will help low-income countries comply with the Paris Agreement rulebook to access carbon markets. So we look at Article 6 and the opportunities of carbon markets. And so a lot of it's not just us investing, in 35,000 biogas digesters, but what will it take then to be able to bring these farmers into a system of a global carbon markets? And, how can we make sure that any revenues generated from the carbon market can then expand these types of projects across the country and the continent? But then we also have the wastewater system. And, it's not a good joke, but as the sanitary engineer for many years, leading the water global practice, whenever we wanted to talk about sanitation, it was always out of sight, out of mind, which is really, really unfortunate. And no one would look at wastewater as a resource. We used to say resource for humankind, right? What are all how you can change waste into a resource. And so there, huge, huge, huge market opportunity, as many of you might know. And there we have an intervention that we did in Ecuador. Just to give you an example, in 2019, we provided over $300 million in financing, co-financing for 2 full sanitation service delivery programs in the city of Guayaquil in Ecuador. But again, when you're working there, you soon realize that these cities of 2 million people, less than half of them even had connections to the sewer pipe. So again, you need the whole full cycle. You can't just focus on how do we then capture, the wastewater treatment plant. You have to look at the whole cycle. And so the part of the program was to install 35,000 new household connections. But also then how do you help the wastewater to think through and how can they transform the waste into biogas that's derived from the sewage sludge? And they've been able to do it, and it now generates more than half of the on-site power to run the plants. But what was important was to fix the policy impediments that didn't allow that to happen. There were all kinds of environmental regulations that were not allowing this to happen. So again, we've taken these examples from Ecuador to how do we help big cities across the developing world. We've replicated this project in Dakar, Senegal, Bogota, and Chennai, India. And again, it's not just the investment, but working together with the local and national governments to unlock all the policy environment and the financing. And finally, in India, and wonderful to know how closely you are working with India, because that's such a huge, and Prime Minister Modi, he's really, really committed to this agenda, which is actually wonderful to have that leadership. And so there we're providing another program of over $250 million, which is a multi-phase approach that supports the development of renewable bioenergy specifically to meet the government's ambition to produce 15 million tons of compressed biogas by 2026. And it's trying to do it to look at the financial sustainability of the sector, right? We really need a sustainable market, which combines credit enhancement through guarantee mechanisms that will help unlock the private investment. What kind of guarantees do private investors need? And then what kind of risk-sharing facility do you need to have, and how do we involve the Small Industries Development Bank in India? So it's not just external capital coming in, but how do we combine and work in partnership? And then actually, how do you work with states and municipalities to develop a robust approach towards the feedstock availability and biogas offtake? So there, what's exciting there is not the $250 million we're putting in, but how it's going to leverage another $550 million of private investment, which is almost twice as much. And then how do we set the targets? How will we develop 100 compressed biogas plants, and how do you provide the lessons learned? And so what we've seen from the early lessons, and I mean, I'm preaching to the converted, you all know this, but when you do start going to larger plants, they do need much more sophisticated models that can be used with a variety of waste streams. And you also need to make sure that you have the continuous access to the feedstock and the proper maintenance, which are big, big challenges. And sometimes it's very difficult for local producers to meet the rigorous quality specifications. So again, all the capacity building that you're doing is so important. And how do we train communities? And it's all the way up the supply chain. So again, how do we then also focus on results-based payment and carbon markets so that you can actually incentivize the sustainability of the results and a continuous payment? But what we've seen from all three of these examples, and they're very, very diverse, is that we're seeing that these operations investments are helping to reduce emissions. They're replacing fossil fuels in key sectors. Second, they're expanding local economic opportunities, and they're creating new economic value chains, increasing farmer revenue, increasing access to sewer connections, wastewater treatment, and taking on the important policy, regulatory, and financing constraints. And they're driving energy efficiency by blending biogas supplies into energy supplies. So again, as we move forward, how do we collectively take this agenda forward? And I think that's what it is. How do we collectively support the governments, especially in the emerging markets, which is our focus, to spur the growth in the biogas industry? How do we work at the global level to keep on pushing to put a proper price on carbon, to remove the subsidies for fossil fuels, to reallocate the harmful subsidies into subsidies or grants that might be needed to jumpstart better solutions and incentivize renewable energy? And then how, finally, do we set very clear targets for biogas into the national NDCs? So going forward, we very much look forward to working very closely with you. We really need to get ideas from the industry specialists on how we can go do that. What are your market interests? What are the barriers? What are the lessons and your interest in working in many of these new emerging markets? So thank you very much, and I appreciate the invitation.